Hi, my name is Alex Centeno, digital media creator. And if this is your first time in our channel, nice to meet you. And if you've been here before, welcome back. In today's episode, we will be learning how to jump right into Davinci Resolve and start creating, editing, and most importantly, color grading your videos. I'll teach you what are the primary settings that you need to be aware of as you start your journey. I'll also give you a quick overview of the primary screens and the options that are more important to set, and I'll explain the process to start creating your own custom looks to create visually stunning images that create an impact in your audience. If you're only getting started using Davinci Resolve, don't worry, because this video will teach you everything that you need to know. We'll cover the creation of a new project, the import of videos, creating a timeline, and also utilizing the note tree. And we'll finish by taking a look at how to export your finished product. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe. We want to make it to 5,000 subscribers by the end of this year. And if we do, we'll make sure to give away a t-shirt or a coffee mug among the subscribers that comment on our videos, including this one. If you're excited, I'm excited. Let's take a look. I am in Davinci Resolve 17.4.1, and the first thing is that we are presented with this modal window here that allows us to create a new project. So I'm just going to click on New Project, give it a name, just Test2, and this is going to create a new project. To the left, we're going to have our media storage, so all the file system that we have in our computer. And we can set favorites here as well, and you can hide this part or show it more depending on your preferences. And same thing with every window that you see with this icon. You can hide them altogether if you prefer. And we're going to have a video description or a thumbnail of the videos that are located where you are looking. In this case, I'm looking at a particular folder that has this clip for me, and I can just grab it and drag it into my media pool. By clicking and dragging, I have added that to my media pool with the settings, for example, the frame rate for the project. What you'll find sometimes is that the moment that you actually drag and drop, you'll be prompted basically asking you if you want to keep those settings or if you want to match the settings to the clip that you are bringing in. So you can say yes if you prefer, or you can just keep the timeline settings that you have already defined. So let's take a look at timeline settings as the first thing. Actually, before we do that, let's take a look at some of the preferences, since this would be probably one of your first times that you are setting this up. Then it's probably a good idea to take a look at the primary ones. So if you go to the settings, you'll find that there's two tabs, System and User. Let's start by User. The one that you want to take a look at first is Project Save and Load, and define live saving and project backups every so often. What that means is that this is going to be saving your projects by default, so they happen on an interval, and so you don't have to worry. Every 5 minutes it just saves, and believe me, it'll save you a lot of headache, especially when the application crashes for some reason. You don't want to be losing your work. The second one is System, and from here what you want to check is that using the 10-bit precision in viewers, if those are available. If you're using your Mac or your PC or even Linux directly on a laptop, you might not even see 10-bit depending on the laptop that you have, but if you're using an external monitor, this might be an important thing to consider. So this actually uses it if it's available, so I would probably just keep it checked all the time and then hit save. The second option here has to do with the actual properties of the project. And we have all sorts of things like presets, master settings, the way that images are scaled, color management, and some others. But of these ones, the most important ones are obviously the timeline resolution. So what is the resolution that you're going to work on? I'm working in a 4K project here, but the most used one is 1920 by 1080. So you can enter that or select it from the dropdown. And that's probably the timeline resolution that you'll be using 90% of the time. So you can set that as a preset if you want. And then in terms of timeline frame rate, if you want to appear cinematic, then you probably are going to stay with 24. But it depends on many factors. You can use 2997, which is a very common one, 30 or even 60 frames per second, which these ones are kind of equivalent to one another. And we're not going to get into the details of the drop frames and whatnot. But in general, you're probably going to be sticking around with 24 frames per second. And then that is going to be the timeline frame rate. And then you have the playback frame rate, which of course is at what frame rate are we going to play this content as opposed to at what frame rate it is. So these two numbers can be different. This number, once you set it, is difficult to change. This one, you can change it anytime. So you don't have to really worry that much about this one. All right, so let's hit, let's take a look at color management as well. So this one is an important one if you're actually making changes outside of the web. So if you're editing a video for YouTube or for your favorite website, then you probably don't need to control for the color science. You're always going to be going to a Rec 709 space, more specifically to an sRGB one. But the Rec 709 would work exactly right. If you're thinking of actually exporting this project, your video, let's say to an HDR screen or a laptop that actually can play P3 content or even a cinema, then you're going to change this color science to the color managed one and select the appropriate color processing mode. So if you're going to an HDR monitor, exporting, for example, HLG, then you're going to change this to HDR. I have a video that details the process of actually exporting to HDR if you're interested. More specifically from the Panasonic GH5. So anyways, you probably want to keep it without color science if you're going to create a video for the web. And pretty much those are the things that you have to kind of set up from the beginning. Let's go ahead and hit save. I have my video in the media pool, which is this section right here, and I can change some settings from here as well. The viewing settings, and in general, I'm going to have a number of clips that are going to be in my media pool. I can create some folders called bins that are going to be in this section so I can organize my media a little bit better. Then we have and also if I select something here, you can see that to the right, you might not have it selected, but you can select the inspector. And this gives you some information about the file or about the audio, the effects, or the video itself. So for example, the zooming or the position. So all of those things can be controlled directly from the media pool. So that is the inspector. Also, you have some information here, for example, the viewer of the audio, the metadata, and this one's an important one. If you have that set as captured, if you actually click here, you don't see any preview. So if you're actually stuck not seeing anything here, just make sure that you don't have capture set up. So just clicking once enables it, toggle, and disables it. Awesome. Cut. This is a kind of a fast-paced editor. So once you get familiar with the whole editing process and you want to be really fast in editing, you probably will end up doing the cut page as opposed to the edit page, at the very least for the beginning of the process. But if you're starting, probably the cut page is going to be a little bit more complex. So In this video, we're not going to talk about the cut page, but probably we'll do another video explaining the cut page as well. And if you're interested, just leave a comment below. All right, so let's take a look at the edit page. In other words, there are two ways of editing a video. One is the cut, one is the editing video, and you can also use them interchangeably. So you can go from cutting to editing and then back and forth. So that's another option as well. In the edit window, and you can see that I'm going from tab to tab to tab, and that's how Blackmagic has designed it on purpose. Like you start with just taking a look at the media, you go to the cut, you go to the edit, and then you move on to effects, fusion, then color correction and grading, audio, and then delivery. So here also you're going to have these windows to actually hide some of the information here. But for the most part, what you have is a viewer here. And if you click and drag, you're going to set this video into the timeline. So this is your timeline here, and you can click and drag to actually preview your clip. And if you click on top, you'll get an orange overlay over the clip that you have selected. And the inspector is going to show you the information that is applicable to that particular selected item on the timeline. That's important because when you're starting to edit, you'll see that sometimes you don't select exactly what you want to be editing, and you'll see this information, but it's not doing anything. The key is to make sure that you select it first. Let's hide the inspector. So if you hide the inspector, you'll have two windows. One is the preview, so where you can actually preview the clips that are not in the timeline, or even the ones that are in the timeline, but you're kind of bringing them up to edit. And then this one is the actual timeline itself. So this one's for clips, individual clips. This one's for the timeline as a whole. Then to the left, you're going to have the toolbox that has generators, effects, transitions, and things of that nature. For example, the titles are going to be there. Video transitions as well. And then the timeline here is going to be displaying like the different tracks of videos and audio. You can add tracks by right-clicking and then clicking where it says Add Track. And you can do audio tracks, you can do video tracks, or you can even add subtitle tracks. All right, let's go ahead and use a couple of the tools for editing. This is just the default display of editing. This one is the most common tool that you'll be using, so you can click and drag the tool, the actual clips inside of the timeline. Position them where you want. You can use the blade to actually cut in that spot, and you can go back to just the selection mode to move the other parts. You can create tracks by even just clicking and dragging, as I did here. And then you can just click and drag the different options on the left. So I'm just going to add a cross dissolve in between these two clips. And so all you have to do is just click and drag, put it here. If I want to change the duration of that, all I have to do is click from the edge of the transition. Let me see if it previews. All right, let's go ahead and do this. I'm just going to make this clip a little bit smaller so maybe we can notice the transition. Let's see. Maybe not. Oh, there you go. All right, pretty cool. So that's kind of the process of the beginning of an editor. So when you're editing, the beginning of your process, basically what it's going to be like is adding a lot of clips to your media pool and then selecting parts of those media clips and adding them to your timeline and then editing that from there. Very commonly, what you're going to do is just double click on a clip. It's going to be loaded in the clip editor. From here, you're going to set input and output points, in with I, and then O, does the output, and that actually creates the cut. And then you can just click and drag from here, or you can just, like as you can see, just it automatically makes the edit the way that you want it. So that's a very simple way of starting with editing of videos. If we want to add a title, then you can just go to titles, grab the title that you prefer, and just click and drag. Set it on a different video track. Once you click, you can go to the inspector and you'll get all the details of that particular clip. So let's say, I want to say in the title, beautiful, and then the underlying title, we're going to say flower. Beautiful flower, there you go. And we can change all sorts of properties, for example, the typography or the sizing of those types, or the tracking, which is the space between characters, or we can change the line spacing or the font style, even the font family, things that almost every editor will have. You have them in Davinci Resolve. So I encourage you to play with all these settings to see what they do. Also, you'll notice that there's a triangle next to some of the settings. What that means is that you can actually animate some of the settings and some of them you can't. But every time that you see a triangle, or not a triangle, a rhombus or a diamond next to a setting, then that means that it's animatable directly from the screen. So all you have to do is just set a starting point, then define a starting point for the animation, and then move in the future, and then set up a different point, and that will create an animation between the 2 points. Don't worry too much about that as you begin, but you'll get more comfortable with that as you go. If you click on top of each one of the titles of the sections, you'll see that you can hide them. Excellent. Let's go to the Mac Daddy of Davinci Resolve, which is color grading. And by the way, let me just say that if you've been using other tools like Premiere or any of the other editors, those are great tools. But Davinci Resolve is the cream of the crop when it comes to color correction. It's a software that used to cost thousands of dollars, and now we have it available for, I think it's $3.99. So I can't encourage you enough to save money and to buy the studio version of Davinci Resolve. Not only because it helps Blackmagic, which is an excellent company, but also because it helps you. We're talking about a serious piece of software for $3.99, something that you won't find anywhere else. So if you're serious about editing and serious about coloring, this is the tool. You don't have to be looking anywhere else. This is actually the top of the line. For the price is almost ridiculous. So, all right, enough of that. They don't pay me, by the way, to say that. So, all right. So coloring in Davinci Resolve is super easy, and I should probably make just a video on this by itself, and maybe I will. So if you want one, just comment in the comments below. You're gonna have a section for stills, which we call the gallery, right? And I'll go into a detail of what that is. We have LUTs, and then we have media pool, which from here you probably won't ever access the media pool. But LUTs you can, and gallery probably you will have open all the time. Then you have the viewer, and then you have the node tree. Those are kind of like the most important components to actually understand. If this is like this, then just make sure that the node tree is enabled. The concept of nodes is similar to the concept of layers, but it's a bit different because what you do in the first node actually affects what you see subsequently in the rest of the nodes. So if I was to, for example, use my first node here, and let's go ahead and give it a name. Let's call this one node 1. So if I create a node here, and then I create a second corrector node, and let's call this one node 2. And by the way, you can change the keyboard shortcuts so that you can do what I'm doing here, which is using just the tab key to name this, because otherwise you would have to right click and then change the label. That takes a long time. So I like to change the labeling to the tab key so that I can actually change it so quickly. So if I do something in node 1, for example, I'm going to go to my color wheels, and from here I'm going to remove the saturation. All right. Now in my node number 2, you can see that the saturation is still at 50%, but there's no saturation. So what that means is that what you do in node number 1 actually affects number 2. So this is like a succession, or they are located in serial mode. All right, so if we actually go to color and we take a look at the different nodes that we have serial nodes, and we have addition of serial nodes before the current, and we have parallel nodes and layer nodes and all sorts of other nodes. But the important thing is, like, when you see them like this, input with the green line and then output with another green line and then another output, then basically what this one does, then it calculates again the image and then it outputs it to this one, and this input actually is not the beginning footage, is the footage after the processing of the first node. Once you grasp that, then you have 90% of color grading, because everything else is just the creativity part, and that extra percentage though is the most difficult one. So not to discourage you, but all right. So let's go ahead and reset this node. All right. On the bottom section here, you're going to have the representation of the timeline clips. Remember that when I was in the editing, I actually cut the clips in two. So it was one single clip and then I cut it into two. So that's why you're going to see two clips here. And if you have an edit, you're going to have like a multitude of clips that are one after the other. So you can actually create color grades for each one of the clips that you see here. In other words, you're going to have a representation of your node tree for each one of the clips that you have here. Let's say that you want to make a global edit. You can do that with different options, but the easiest one is to select the two and then create a group of them or add them into the current group. And when you do so, then you'll be able to affect them as a group as opposed to just affect them as a clip. And you'll see now, if you click on this drop down, you'll see that you'll have a pre-clip group and a post-clip group, and those actually affect both of the clips or all the clips that you've added to the same group. So let's go back to clip, and of course timeline affects all of the timeline. So the entirety of the clips are affected by timeline. All right. To the bottom, you're going to have all the tools that actually affect the images. And I won't go into the details of each one because that would take a long time. But the majority of the time you're going to spend with color wheels. If you're doing HDR, obviously the HDR version of the wheels, which are very similar, except that you can have more control over the different aspects of the curve. You're going to have a little bit of the RGB mixer. You're going to have curves. And if you're coming from layering software like Photoshop or things like that, if you're familiar with photography, you're going to be very, very comfortable using curves and different types of curves. Some of them are just representation of light and color in the RGB mode, or they can be a representation of hues or saturations or luminosity, or the combination of those things. So depending on what you select here, you can modify the image based on those parameters. The important thing is that you have like all sorts of these panels that change depending on what you select. And you have some primary tools that affect the entirety of the image, for example, the color wheels, and you have secondary corrections, for example, the qualifying. So you can select a particular portion of an image based on a hue or a saturation level or a luminosity. And depending on what you select, you're going to affect only those portions of the image. So that's called, in color correction, that's called secondary corrections. The primary corrections are just global corrections that you're doing to the entirety of the clip. So I would say 70% of the time you're going to be using the color wheels. And they come in different versions. The same changes, the same wheels can be seen as primaries, logarithmic, or actual bars. So if you want changes that are defined with in and out points, then you're going to be using the logarithmic curves. If you want them to just be predefined as lift, gamma, and gain, then you're going to be using the primary color wheels. So if I modify the luminosity of the gain, for example, you'll see that the highlights of my images start going up and blowing up, but I don't have any way of determining where that cutoff starts. In other words, what is considered a highlight. It just basically says anything that I consider a highlight, I'm just going to increase in luminosity. On the other hand, the log actually allows me to define the ranges of each one. So the high range is starting at 0.550. And what that means is that anything above this is considered a highlight, and anything between 0.333 and 0.55 is going to be considered a midtone, and then anything under 0.333 is going to be considered a shadow. And I can change those definitions. And so by using the log wheels, I get much more control of how I affect the different components of the image. And if we want to take even further action or further control, you can use the actual HDR wheels. But as a beginner editor or colorist, you're probably going to use a lot of the primary ones. Not the bars, not the log, primary. And I would say that you can comfortably become a really good colorist just by using the primaries. And also, just as a caveat, if you're coming from a photography background using Photoshop or Lightroom, then probably you can also do very well with the curves. And there are some videos that talk about the benefits and the drawbacks of using curves as opposed to color wheels. I'm not going to go into those details. If your image looks good to you, that's all that matters at first. So don't worry about that. Just use the images, the tools that you feel most comfortable with. If you're in the studio version, then also you'll have some parameters to administrate the noise reduction, either the spatial or the temporal noise reduction. Otherwise, you won't have access to these tools. And I believe that they may be changing that. And so in the latest versions, you might even have this for free. And then we have the color warper. And this tool basically allows you to change specific hues. So I want you to take a look at here at the purple. So if I actually modify like the purple itself, then I can make it be more blue. And it's not affecting the other hues of my image. So it's a very powerful tool as well. So I recommend checking that one out. We have the qualifier for secondary corrections. We have the windows that you can have different circular windows or gradient windows, things like that. And then you have sharpness and blurring. You have the sizing of the keys, or like actually looking at how when you select the mask, you'll actually be able to define from here how transparent that mask is. Again, this is a little bit more complex and more advanced, so you don't have to worry too much about those things. And to the right, you're going to have a representation of the different scopes. So you have parade, waveform, vector scope, and some tools related to those items. For example, you can change the show skin tone indicator checkbox, and that would actually show you the skin tone indicator. So if I have a skin tone inside of my footage, then I can just isolate it and make sure that that skin tone is touching that indicator, making my footage look the way that is intended. Because what happens is that when you have a skin that looks very far from this line, it actually looks weird. And you wouldn't notice it necessarily if you've been working in your footage. You kind of get used to it. So by looking at it just from a tools perspective, you'll be able to know, okay, this is not correct. So just make sure that you move it there and you're good to go. And we have histograms and chromaticity as well. Probably 70% of the time is going to be parade and waveform. So I would probably leave it at that. If you have a big monitor, right now I'm using like a laptop, so I have like very limited real estate. But if you have a big monitor or two monitors, then you can even like display more than one of these scopes at the same time. So that's very, very beneficial, especially if you have a secondary monitor. You can be displaying your scopes at the same time that you're working in the different components of it. All right, and so another tip is as you grow in your role as a colorist, you'll probably start repeating the way you do things. For example, for me, one of the things is I like to first control for exposure. Then I like to control the contrast. Then I like to control for saturation. Then I like to control for, let's say, the actual look. All right. So as you can see, I'm creating nodes that are serialized. In this case, I'm controlling serialized nodes, but always I use this in every project that I do, like almost the same tree. It varies a little bit, but almost it starts from the same tree. So what I can do is that I can create what we call a still from this, so that I don't have to recreate these nodes every. So I can just right click, grab a still. And by the way, I have to right click on top of my viewer here. Grab a still, and you'll see that I have a representation of that particular still. Exactly that moment in time. And so I can give it a nice label that represents it. Let's call it beginning node tree. And so I can just, let's say that I'm here with a new clip, and I can just easily just apply the grade, and that's going to recreate my node tree so that I don't have to recreate all this every single time. But it's not just the node tree, but also the settings of those nodes. So for example, if I go here and I was to, let's say, make some adjustments to this image. I'm making some exposure. I'm going to make some contrast changes here, adding a little bit of contrast and pivoting there a little bit. Then I'm going to add a little bit of saturation, changing the hue a little bit there as well. That's looking pretty good. And then I'm going to modify the look a little. And I want to show you here what I'm doing. So you can see in the middle there in the gamma, I'm actually changing the gamma. And change also colors, a little bit of the gain and lift. And let's say that that's the look that I like. So if I grab this still, now I have one that has that coloring, that contrast, that exposure and saturation, and then one that is just a beginning node tree. So I can call this one my favorite grade. And then let's say that I'm beginning a new project, or I'm adding other clips to my timeline. I don't have to start from scratch. They need to look very similar anyways, so I can just go ahead and apply. Once you're done with your coloring, then we can go into delivery. Delivery is going to give you some presets at the top. So you can just export the audio, export to 265, H264, ProRes, making a master, or going directly to YouTube or Vimeo, you can select those presets, or you can create your own. So you can just give it a file name, a location, then defining if you want to render this as a single clip or individual clips, so that every single clip that you have in the timeline gets saved either as a whole or individually. And then file, audio, and video. So each one of these tabs has information, and the file defines how the file name is going to be defined. Especially if you have individual clips, you're going to want to have a custom name for each one of those clips, because otherwise it'll just like overwrite each one. So make sure that you change the file naming convention so that it actually accounts for an individual naming. Then we have audio, and the audio settings, and then video for the codec and format that you want to use. The most common thing is going to be 1920 by 1080 at a frame rate of 24. You can even mark the chapters, and this is a thing new in 17.4.1. Also, you can define the quality. If you're going to the web directly, you can probably use the restrict to and give it a specific number. Otherwise, you can leave it to automatic, especially if you're going to YouTube, for example. Automatic is perfectly fine. And from here, I liked in the advanced settings, I also like to go to data levels 4. That's to ensure that it actually goes instead of video to full. But other than that, I keep all the other settings the same. And that's about it. Once you're ready, once you have everything the way that you want it and the location that you want, etc., then you just add to the render queue. I'm just going to leave it as untitled, hit save, and then it adds it to the render queue on the right. Just make sure that this endpoint and endpoint are actually where you want them, which is the entire timeline. Because otherwise, if you actually have this like this, and you were to add that project to the render queue, it's actually going to start rendering from that point. So I want to make sure that it says entire timeline. You can also right click and say entire timeline. If you actually purposefully want only a portion of your video, then like just position your cursor and your playhead at the right moment, and then right click and put a mark in at that. Excellent. Once you're ready, all you have to do is click render all, and that's going to render the particular video in the particular location that you're given. All right, so we have done Davinci Resolve 17.4.1 overview, and of course we've covered a lot of information, from how to deal with the media pool, how to start editing, and how to color grade our footage. We didn't talk about the specifics of how you go about doing those things. For example, we didn't talk about the separation of color correction and color grading. Color correction being the portion where you take your clips and you make them be correct. For example, in terms of exposure, contrast, and the right white balance. Color grading is a different process in which you are actually inserting styling that is going to enhance your story. For example, if you wanted something to feel romantic and really warm, you don't want to be using blue and green tones in the shadows, because that's going to look more creepy and dark. So color grading deals with the styling of your footage, whereas color correction actually deals with just correcting the footage so that the black is black, the white is white, and the midtones are in the range, in the proper range. So we didn't talk about those things, but at the very least, this video should give you a starting point as a starting editor, so that you don't have to go through the painful process of learning Davinci Resolve by yourself, which is a difficult task altogether. With this introduction, you should be good to go. Practice a little bit, and you should be going in. So, if you liked it, please recommend it to someone else, a friend or a loved one. It really helps us move the channel and reach more people, and help more people out there that want to be editors, and color correctors, and color graders, in general colorists. So If you didn't like it, also give us a comment or a dislike, because that also helps me know that you didn't like this particular type of content, so that we can focus a bit on the type of content that you guys like. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck. Take care. Bye.